I say, what about our voting machines? We better get a paper trail. Those cheaters never go to jail. While they're passing bucks, we're sitting ducks with those voting machines. We don't need no Karl Rove around here. We don't want no Karl Rove around here. All he brings with him is trouble and division and dirty tricks, and we don't need no Karl Rove around here.
The kind of things that I've been discovering recently have really shocked me. I didn't realize the extent to which we have continued to connect ourselves with Al-Qaeda long after the end of the Cold War. You know, I found some instances, you know, in the War on Freedom where we liaised with these guys and we used them here and there. In the new book, The War on Truth, my argument is much more kind of shocking. That throughout the Cold War the post-Cold War period, we have systematically connected ourselves with Al-Qaeda across the globe. I looked at many different regions of the world, all of them very strategic to the United States and the West. I looked at the Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa, and so on, the Asia Pacific. And every single one of those regions, I picked a core country, and I found the same bizarre pattern, that we have a state with which we are allied, which has penetrated a domestic terrorist group connected to Al-Qaeda, is manipulating that group for political purposes, state consolidation and so on and so forth, and we in the meantime are providing this state with financial aid, military aid, and that aid is going into Al-Qaeda's pockets. Now, just to give you a few concrete examples, I like talking about Algeria, just it's a favorite of mine. It's a topic that I've studied for many years. Algeria is, I don't know if you know the history of this country, there's an ongoing civil war there between the state and various terrorist groups, which are supposedly Islamic. And one of the most prominent groups is called the GIA. This is connected to Al-Qaeda. It's been well known, it's well documented. Now this group, according to Algerian officials who have defected from Algerian secret services, they've spoken to the British press, the French press, they've come out and they've said the GIA has been manipulated and penetrated by Algerian state secret services. Why? They are trying to prolong a war and justify their war against Muslims in the country, policies of repression and so on and so forth. This will sound very familiar to you. So what is our policy towards Algeria? We are in bed with Algeria. We have heavy investments in terms of oil and gas. We are piling the regime with financial aid and military aid. The French in particular have very close relationship. In terms of military intelligence ties, we are like this, fingers crossed. We know exactly what is going on. How far does this pattern extend? Go to the Philippines, we have the same phenomenon, Abu Sayyaf, which is a domestic terrorist group in the Philippines. A courageous politician in the Philippines, Senator Pimelton, spoke out in the Philippine Senate and he said, I have names of people in the Philippine military intelligence who are handling Abu Sayyaf, who are coddling them with CIA approval. And we are funneling military assistance to these guys. And he named names and he said we need to have an investigation. Surprise, surprise, the investigation never happened. What about the investigation here? We are not looking into this phenomenon. The same phenomenon repeats itself throughout the globe. So the thesis of my book is that we have been doing this for many years. This has undermined our national security not only on 9/11. 9/11 was not something new. This has been happening for years. This happened in 1993. I was shocked to discover that we had connected. The blind Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, he was an asset during the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. So the American and British governments, we're both in on this together. You know, which it brings us back to the whole Downing Street conundrum. We've been doing this kind of thing together. There are these covert operations going on for years. It's up to us now to look at this issue and bring this to the public. This whole series of events that we do in the congressional hearing, the events, the press conferences, we can't stop there. We need to lobby our political representatives. We need to lobby our media. We need to have our own media. We need to bring this to the public. And we can't stop there. This has to end now. We cannot let this go on any longer, because if we do, we're going to be faced with so many problems, not only in terms of growing political problems with crushing civil liberties. with growing anti-terrorist legislation in the United States, in Western Europe, in Britain. We're going to be faced with more wars. We're going to be faced with growing energy resource depletion. We're going to be faced with growing environmental problems. And unless we do this, our civilization will be collapsing around us. So we have an agenda, we have a very real vested interest in survival here.
9/11 was not only an event that changed history and the way we live, it was also an environmental disaster of historic proportions. The World Trade Center was a city with its own zip code. When it fell, hundreds of tons of asbestos were pulverized and could be inhaled, and they were taken by the plume miles beyond ground zero. In the World Trade Center were over 50,000 computers, they each made with over 4 pounds of lead. You had tens of thousands of fluorescent light bulbs, each of which had enough mercury to contaminate a quarter of a city block. Smoke detectors with radioactive americium-241. A month after the disaster, they found very and ultrafine particles that were the highest of any found around the world, including at the burning Kuwaiti oil fields. The air had the alkalinity of drain cleaner, and yet the EPA said early on, good news, the air is safe to breathe. Now, we know several things. We know that not only were they mistaken, we know they were lying. A memo showed that. We also know that the White House Council on Environmental Quality changed at least one of their press releases. Now, why was the White House so keen to get people back into Lower Manhattan? Well, the Inspector General's report issued in August of '03 said one of the reasons was that there was a keenness to reopen Wall Street. 3.5 years later, we're beginning to see the results of these disastrous policies of the White House. Over half of the heroes who toiled at Ground Zero now have debilitating respiratory symptoms, and we see analogous symptoms among residents. And by the way, $125 million, which was offered to the Ground Zero workers, was later rescinded by the White House.
Half of New York City does not buy the official story as it is. And I can tell you, you go to New York and you talk to people and you ask them, do you think they knew, or do you think maybe they blew up the towers? And about half the people will say, yeah. So why don't we go and show some strength in the street?
And so the feds have yet to bring anyone to justice. So we're waiting for them to do that. We're waiting for them to release the many surveillance videos that were on the Murrah building, on the buildings around it, that shows exactly what happened, who pulled that Ryder truck up, who was in the other vehicles that were in front of the Murrah building that day, and there were many other people involved. We're waiting for them to run the fingerprints. There were 1,034 fingerprints in this case that were taken. And this is part of the testimony in the federal trials. They never ran the fingerprints on the biggest terrorist act in the history of the country, of the FBI at that time. Now tell me when that happens in a capital crime. It never happens. They didn't run the fingerprints against their national database. If people don't stand up about the Oklahoma City case and all of these other kinds of illegal activities that our government is directly involved in, it's going to happen again. And of course, that's what happened with 9/11. It happened again.
However, mainstream media no longer produces news for the mainstream population, nor should we consider it plural. Instead, it's more accurate to speak of big media today as the corporate media, and to use the term in a singular sense as it refers to a monolithic top-down power structure of self-interested news giants.
30 years ago, Ben Bakdickian wrote his first book on media monopoly. He said there's 50 major media corporations in the United States, and we were all somewhat shocked. His latest book has us down to 6, so that in one generation we've consolidated media from 50 to 6 corporations. Now, many of us know about the lawsuit that Steve Wilson and Jane Akery filed against Fox about 5 years back for failure to cover bovine growth hormone, Monsanto's BGH in milk. They won that lawsuit in Florida as a whistleblowers, but then they ended up losing in appellate court based on the fact that Fox's defense was it's not against the law to lie to the public. Therefore, you can't be a whistleblower unless you violated a law. And they won on that. And so what Fox was saying, and what many of the corporations that put briefs in support of Fox, was that they own the news. They will tell journalists what the news will be. So if you've seen the Outfox movie, you know that journalists are saying, we get daily commands from top down. This is how you will cover this news story. So we can't trust the Washington Post to be fair and objective about Lockheed Martin defense overruns, and we can't trust ABC to report about Halliburton's and sole source contracts in Iraq. And we can't trust any of them to tell us the truth about 9/11 and many of the other issues, DU, the military that have been on this stage today. Corporate media in this country, we have to say, is no longer feeding the mainstream people. Instead, they're feeding their own self-interest, and most Americans know that. So people need to look at alternative sources, independent news, and increasingly that's happened. And we know that message, and we know that that's mostly who's here today. And we know that millions of people will see this video. They're going to know what we have done today. They will know about the hearings, and they'll really start to think through what 9/11 is about and the big lies. Thank you.
That breaking through into the media is very important and, of course, very difficult nowadays when the media are so controlled by so few people who have such vested interests in the whole system that makes money out of war, that makes money out of killing people, which we have to stop. And if you want to stop that kind of anti-Americanism, if you want to stop terrorism, there are many, many voices in the Muslim world that say the answer to terrorism isn't war, the answer to terrorism is justice. If America learns the truth about what happened on 9/11, they will want different leadership.
From there, we went to the Supreme Court, where I learned of 5 laws from the Justice Department, 5 laws of immunity, which gave my assailants immunity, and all assailants in the military immunity, if they rape, maim, or murder their own or others, nationally and internationally. These laws are the Bivens Doctrine, the Ferris Doctrine, intramilitary immunity, Title VII, and U.S. Code 552A. So rape is part of the military system. Then I discovered what's known as the McDowell Checklist. The United States Pentagon knowingly and purposely put together questions asked of rape victims in the military that would legitimately throw out legitimate rape victims' questions. Charles P. McDowell works for the Pentagon, and they are allowing not only rapes to happen under national policy, but the honing of rapists throughout our country. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, Abu Ghraib is not an anomaly. It is standard operating procedure for the military. The reason being is that the United States will not sign making rape a wrongdoing, a human rights crime. We also will not sign the International Criminal Courts Treaty, which will hold us accountable in international situations. We don't do the protection of women or the protection of children treaties. And this is to undermine world powers so that they cannot rise in their own right and stand on their own 2 feet as global people. How is this impacting America? It is impacting because, quite honestly, many of these rapists and assailants have come out of the United States military and into our communities. Some of their names you may recognize: Jeffrey Dahmer, Berkowitz, DeSalvo, Yates, Francois out of New York. You have Ridgway out of California, who's killed 48 women. You have Charles Ng, a Marine Corps member out of Washington, who entirely devastated families, killing even infants. Or how about children of military, those who've been abused in the system? Ted Bundy, known to have killed approximately 200 women across this country before he was executed in Florida. John Wayne Gacy, who killed numerous young men and boys. Or Eric Harrison, the Columbine shooter. These are not anomalies, ladies and gentlemen. These are impacts, and the impacts are global, they are strong, they are real.
And yet, for the first time, we are on the verge of a truly global empire, an empire with no borders. Our own country is involved in what Richard Falk and others call the global domination project. I'm a Christian theologian, so what I am particularly upset about is they're claiming to do this empire and this destruction of the world in the name of God, so that when voting time comes, we have a chance to make a difference. But of course, one of the issues is we've got to make sure that our votes are really counted rather than camouflaged by voting machines. There is one thing they will not tolerate. If the truth about 9/11 is revealed, that will bring this administration down, and more than that, it will reveal the values on which this American global domination project is built.
So a little about Code Pink. I think I was invited to speak today because we represent, I guess, the means for getting, one of the means anyway, for getting the truth out. And it's true that we are part of a much larger picture in America of people who are seeking the truth, people who are articulating the truth, and people who are pushing our elected officials and anyone else they can find to hear the truth and to be accountable for the truth. And we started right here in front of the White House in November of 2002, before the war started. The After Downing Street Coalition, which Code Pink is a member of, is doing. Our major purpose is to keep the Downing Street Minutes alive in the media by putting pressure locally, nationally, letters to the editor, op-eds, etc.
Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta, he's still the Transportation Secretary, he said, when he was asked by the 9/11 Commission, quote, "Did the higher level of terrorist chatter before 9/11 result in any action across the government?" Unquote. He was asked this. His response, no. The FBI, which was well aware there was a high threat level, they told state and local law enforcement in the summer of 2001 that the terrorism threat level was, quote, low, unquote. People, unfortunately, are extremely misinformed. Polls showing up to 70% of the people think that Saddam Hussein was the 9/11 mastermind. 9/11 is just as relevant as ever. Activists working on any issue need to help challenge the official story of 9/11 and cut down the core myth upon which the Bush administration justifies its policies.